Then we're talking about worksheets. We're going to go through and talk about the sheets down the bottom. We're also going to talk about columns and row manipulation, and then we'll apply those to a large workbook structure. So we're going to start right down here where it says worksheets. So this is where it talks about these sheets on the bottom, where we're going to right-click on them and actually manipulate this information. So we're talking about inserting a sheet, we're talking about deleting sheets, renaming sheets, moving sheets, copying sheets, and all the concepts are written in the book, so you can go back and look through this. Don't have to take notes on any of this stuff. This move and copy is kind of interesting. Tab color, hiding sheets, unhiding sheets, navigation capabilities, and also selecting multiple sheets. So those are the concepts we're going to talk about right now. So to do this, we want to open up a certain file. I think what file I asked to open up here. I think it was called Worksheet 1. That's right here, it's Worksheet 1. Go to Excel, go to File, Open, go to Browse. Again, we're going to go over to the C drive, choose the data folder. We're going to choose the first folder in the list called Excel 365-1. And we're going to navigate down to this file called Worksheet 1. So hopefully you can open this file up and kind of click on it with me, and that helps you to understand better. I think getting your hands on it would also generate the questions, because if you aren't able to do something, then you can stop and say, well, I couldn't do that. How did you do that again? Did you right-click or double-click or whatever? So you can ask those questions. Okay, so this one is nothing really magical about this. It's kind of some things that we've been doing before. The other day, we were talking about this very same kind of layout where you have these salespeople and then certain information about the salespeople. But we also have a February, March, and April, and May down here. Okay, we're going to start with January, and we're going to just look at these functions on the bottom. If you right-click on January, of course, you're going to get a little menu. Now, I use the insert and the delete quite a bit. I don't necessarily use the rename or the copy or move. There is some additional capabilities with the copy and move here, but we're going to talk about insert and delete. So if I insert a sheet, it says, okay, you want to insert an Excel sheet? Say, okay, that inserts a new blank sheet. If you right-click on that new sheet and you press delete, you can delete the sheet as fast as you can create it. So those are the two that we use a lot. I don't necessarily like to do the rename feature. If I double-click on January, I can simply rename January. You don't need to have to right-click to do it. I usually just double-click. So I want to change January to Jan, then I can just double-click on that and rename it that way. I also don't like to use the right-click and move, because the reason why is I can click on January and grab it with my left mouse and drag it to the right and look for that little arrow that pops up. See that little arrow there? Wherever I let go of it with my mouse, it drops it in that place. So I can move it back and forth and let go, and I can move it around. So if you have to slide these around, you can simply move them around by dragging it and dropping them. And watch for that little arrow. Now, another one that is really important here is that when you move it, hold the control key down when you move it. So if I hold the control key down and then I move January, I can actually make a copy of January. Now, why is this so important? Because a lot of times if I'm getting ready to modify January, making some major changes to it, you might want to make a copy of it. So you can simply hold the control key down, make a quick copy of that sheet, and then you can actually have a duplicate of it in case you have to go back and look at the formulas from a later time. That's what's really important about this. Then the other thing I do, once I make a copy of it, I would right-click on that copy, and there's an option here called Hide. So then you hit the Hide, and it actually hides it. So now I don't even see the copy anymore. So a lot of people will ask me, you're probably thinking this right now, how do you unhide it? You would right-click on any sheet you want, and there's an option called Unhide. And it will display all the hidden sheets, and then you'd be able to bring them back and say, I want to unhide January, and brings it back. So that I can go through and do that one more time. I'm going to right-click on January. I'm going to delete January, that copy. I'm going to click on January, and I'm going to simply move it by dragging to the right and dragging to the left. I can also hold the Control key down, drag it, and make a copy of it. So I don't know if you understand the significance of that and how easy that was to do, but so many times you might want to make a copy of it. I even go into this January here and say make a copy. I'll say put in here maybe the date of 4-15-2020. So maybe that was the date that I actually made a copy of the January sheet. And then I can take that date and right-click on it, hide it, so it isn't even visible anymore. See, so that's an important little element of hiding, of why you'd want to hide it for various purposes. All right, so that's important to know. Now, let's talk about navigation a little bit. Has everybody seen these little arrows here? So you click on the arrows, I can click on these little dots and move back this way. And I click on these arrows and slide back and forth between the different sheets. If I add more sheets on the end, I can do that too. Or I can move these arrows. I hope everybody has kind of stumbled across those little arrows, right? But one thing a lot of people don't know about is that you can right-click on those arrows. So what happens when you right-click on the arrows? It actually gives you a little menu. So I can actually click on September and say go straight to September. But now I want to go back to January, but I don't want to scroll back and forth. I can just right-click, click on the January sheet and say okay, and it takes me straight to January. So I can actually jump back and forth by just right-clicking on those arrows and moving to whatever sheet I'm going to move to. And so often people scroll around on this sheet when they have a lot of sheets on the bottom, and it's hard for them to actually see how it all fits together. So who was asking this? Devin was asking about control drag. Yeah, you can control drag a sheet and all the formulas. Everything stays the same. It works just. Is that your question?
But I don't want the data, Jeff. So we use this function a lot where we have the 12 months a year. We want just the formulas to go to the next month, but we don't want the previous month's data to go with it.
You have to delete the data. So I would just drag it like this, and then create it, and I would just select the data area and just hit the delete key one time, and the delete goes away. See it?
Okay.
Pretty straightforward, I think, but you'd have to at least get rid of the data that way. But you can make a copy of it, and everything's going to stay intact. So it's important to be able to do that quickly and to be able to make a copy of these formulas and have to try to reproduce them. So that is a little bit about the control drag, which is the copy and all that. Okay, let's take a look at a right-click on this. We talked about these up here. Now this one here is kind of important because a lot of people don't really understand the significance of this, what's called move or copy. And you think, well, I just showed you how to move or copy something. You just simply move it this way, or you move it back, or if you want to copy, you hold your control. So what use is that function? Well, what that function is helpful for, if you right-click on January, choose move or copy, see, I can move that sheet or copy that sheet. So if I want to make a copy of January, I can click on January and make a copy. That's what most people think it can do. But here's the most important part of this. If I highlight the January and I make a copy of it, I can choose this little arrow here and copy it to another workbook. So if you're going to start a new workbook, but you want to use some data from the current workbook, you can open up both workbooks. Now, if I take this and I copy this January data over to the interface sheet, and I want to copy it to the end of the list. So I'm making a copy of January, and I'm copying it to the interface sheet, to the end of the list, and say, okay, now I'm in the interface sheet, and I have a copy of January in that sheet. So the idea that that's a real significant aspect of this. There's another interesting thing with tab colors. I don't want to have to go through and change my colors to be the same. So I'm going to get rid of a couple of these things. I'm going to select, I'm going to hide this sheet. I'm going to get rid of these, hide these off here, just get rid of them. I'm going to get back to my January, February, and March sheet. This kind of, I've messed up January, February, March quite a bit. So I'm going to click on April, May, and June. So if I click on April, now keep in mind that this is a common characteristic. If I were to click over on A10, hold the Shift key down and click on I-18, it highlights everything between the two. So if I click on A2, hold the Shift key down, click on I-7, it actually highlights everything between the two. So you can use this selection, this Shift key, to select multiple sheets. So if I click on April down here and hold the Shift key down, click on June, see how it highlights all three of them. So if I right-click on one of those sheets, then I can change my tab color so that they're all evenly set up. So I can click on that, change the tab color to red, maybe you can see it change. Now when you want to see what it looks like, you click out of it to make sure that it got tabbed. So again, I don't want to have to go through and do these one at a time. I'm going to hold my Shift key down, select all three of them, change my tab color to some other color like green maybe. Click out of it so I can change my color code. So I don't want to have to do that one at a time. Now I'm going to click on April, hold the Shift key down and click on June. Now I've got April, May, and June highlighted right now. There's another very important element here. That is that once I select April, May, and June, I can come up to cell A1. I can format A1 to be red and a little bigger. I can actually highlight this area, the sales rep area. Again, I'm going to use my adjacent selection right now, hold the Control key on the keyboard, and then highlight these titles up on top. So now I have all my labels highlighted. I click on my little paint bucket and format that to be a certain shade. So the idea of that is I can go through and format this sheet. But what did I just format, by the way? April, May, and June at the same time. That's the significance of this. So if I wanted to make it zoom in a little bit on it, I can make sure I highlight all three of those and zoom in on one of this. I can straighten these out, put the top here, and then I actually did that to all three sheets. See what I did there? So that's what's significant about this, is that you want to be able to, yeah.
I'm sorry. Every time I try to highlight my three tabs, I hold the Shift key, and then I go and try to move, to get April, May, June. It just moves April.
Right,
what am I doing wrong?
You don't drag. You hold the Shift key down, and then you click on June, and it highlights everything between the two.
Ah, okay. All right.
Click on July, hold the Shift key down, and just click on September, and it highlights them all.
Okay, thank you.
So now I have January. See, I have January, February, and all this different scaling. I got January is scaled in, February is not scaled in. So I'm going to click on January, hold the Shift key down, click on March, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this. Zoom out a little bit. And then February and March are also zoomed in. So that's the idea behind the selection of these sheets down below. And this is something that is extremely useful. So the things that are extremely useful, I believe, are one is the selection technique of multiple sheets. The other one is this move and copy. The others are fairly easy to figure out, but this one's significant because why? I want to create a new blank workbook, but I want this sheet to be part of that new workbook. So you can kind of start a new workbook off with an existing list of information. So those are the sheet manipulation. There are worksheets down below. How do you manipulate these sheets? That's important about that. So now we're also going to talk about rows and column manipulation. If you click on C, B, D, E, F, you can actually take these little lines in between the letters and make these wider or smaller. You can make them smaller or wider. If you have dollar signs in the formula like this, that's because it's not wide enough. So you can either drag it out like this to get it wider, but another interesting way to do this would be to double click on the line in between the two letters. If I double click, it actually spans it all the way. If I double click on this one, it collapses it as far as it needs to go. Now, say you want these to be evenly spaced out. In that case, I would select B all the way to I. You could also click on B, hold the Shift key down, and then click on I to do it all at one time. Same concept that we just talked about. And then when you move one of the lines in between the letters, you can move it to the right here, and you can see how I'm evenly spacing everything out. So spaced everything out evenly. Now for a budget or some sort of layout like this, I want to make it look very symmetric and evenly spaced out. For a database, I want it to maximize it or minimize it as far as it can go. So if I select these highlight and you double click in between the B or the C or any line in between the two, if you double click, it will collapse it as far as it needs to go. Meaning that the labels, the largest piece of information, will fit in the double click. Now you can imagine if we have a very large database that has thousands of records, we don't know how wide we want this column to be. So in that case, for a database, you want to double click because you want it to maximize it to the largest piece of data, thousands of lines long. And that way everything will be visible. But for a budget like this, we want to be able to make it so that it's evenly spaced out and just looks a little nicer, evenly spaced out. You see I have the pound signs in there. So the problem is, if I were to select like this, I double click, that's going to collapse it as far, but they don't look evenly spaced out. If I take one of the lines and move it to the right, I can evenly space them out. Now my percentage did not fit, so I'm going to go a little bit more. Percentage isn't quite there yet, so a little bit more. Now it fits. So the percentage fits, and all these labels fit just fine, and they're evenly spaced out the same distance. A lot of people, what I see them do is right-click on the column, and there's an option called column width. I can go through each column one at a time and change the width so that they're evenly spaced out, but it's much faster to simply drag it across the top, double-click or right-click and drag, and you can actually do that. Now, I can also do that with rows and columns. So if I select all these columns here, 2 through 7, and I drag one of them downward, then that actually evenly spaces them out. So say you've got a lot of information, it's very top-heavy, and you want to kind of give a little more of a gap between them, then you can simply click on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, go to the little line in between the two and drag it down a little bit and space it out. Now, if you want to collapse it all the way as small as it can possibly go, then you would double click and that would collapse it all the way. The rows and column manipulation is what we're referring to right now. Now, there may be times when you might want to hide certain columns or rows. So if I right-click on C, for example, I can insert a column, I can delete a column, but I can also hide a column. So if you click Hide, that hides the column. If you don't know your ABCs, you'll never figure it out, but if you know your ABCs, you'll see that there's a letter missing here somewhere. So because there's a letter missing, it looks like there's something hidden in here. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll select around that hidden area, right-click, and I can unhide it. So what would be the purpose of hiding a row or column? Why would we want to hide something? Maybe it's proprietary?
Too much data.
Too
much data you don't need to see.
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you one that's really, really important for hiding columns is printing. Let's say you want to print a database, but you don't want to print every column, so you would hide the columns you don't want to print, and then you print it. And that way you're not messing up the database at all. A lot of times I've seen people save databases off, then delete a bunch of columns and then print, and then throw the database away. but you don't need to do that at all. You just simply right-click on them, hide the columns that you don't want to see. I don't want to see this net profit, and I can hide those columns, and then I can simply select it and then print whatever's left over. Now, since I have several columns here hidden, I don't want to go through and select each one at a time. So I can click on the right in between A and 1. I can select the entire worksheet, right-click, and then hide them all at one time. So that's your hiding columns and rows. Now we want to talk about inserting columns and rows too. So if I right-click on E, insert a new column. So you see I actually created a new column, but you've got to be careful because when you start manipulating things, we've got to go back and make sure your formulas are correct. So in this case, if I click on this formula here, you see this formula does not include that area. So see, I'm going to do a new sport here or something. I'm going to put in here fitness, bike, outdoor. How about if I say jogging or something like that? So running gear or something like this. Okay, so some running gear. Now, the problem is that this formula does not include that information. So what I want to do, now here's something that's rather interesting about Excel. If I put in a number in here like this, hit the Enter key, watch the formula update. You see it change? So it actually changed. Now it didn't change these others down below here, but the minute I put a number in, it will change. You can't trust Excel to do this correctly because if you basically fill it down like this, see, that actually filled it down, but it didn't actually update these formulas. You have to go back later and double check these formulas to make sure things are correct. The minute you start manipulating things, you should go back at some point and check your formulas to make sure they're correct. Again, you can't assume, and you don't want somebody else to find the error. You don't want somebody else to discover that you've got errors on your sheet. You've got to have a technique to do that. So we're going to go back through it, and we're going to double click on each formula to make sure that everything's going to be working properly. Now, if I right-click on E and delete that column, then I'm hoping that the formulas got updated properly, but I don't know for sure. So I'm going to go back and double-click on it, each form, to make sure that everything got updated properly. I just want to make sure that everything's working properly. So the checking technique is something you're going to have to go back and do when you start manipulating columns and rows like this. So that's something about the columns and rows, of manipulating these columns and rows, which is key. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and do this again, but I want to go to July, and here's July. It's kind of scaled up. If I move this out a little bit, if I move these columns out a bit, you see how I really kind of messed up the order of these, as you can see. I'm going to go to August, and again, I'm going to change these again, several fields this way, just different ones, randomly. I'm going to September, and September I'm actually going to zoom in on a little bit so I can see a little bit better. So now I've got July is kind of different than August, and August is different than September. So what I want to do is I want to go back and make them symmetrically the same. So we're going to combine a couple of concepts together. We're going to click on July, hold the Shift key down, click on September. Now I've highlighted all those sheets on the bottom. Then I'm going to simply click on B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. I'm going to move one of the little lines to the right, and I'm going to move them a little bit more until that percent of total fills up. Okay, I just re-straightened these out. I also want to go to my zoom tool and zoom in a little bit so that I can see it a little bit more clearly on the screen. So now what did I just change? I actually changed the columns and rows to be identical on all three sheets by selecting them. If I click out in October, that unselects them. So this is important because combining these two features together is key. How would you make these look identical? If I were to print these out and they were all different sizes, they would look horrible next to each other on a printout or some sort of booklet. the idea of that is you want to use the selection technique to select all 3 sheets at the same time and then change your columns and rows across all 3 sheets. That combination is vital. I have shown that to people that have been very experienced in Excel, and that's something they just didn't know. And they were just like, they just shoot themselves thinking, this is horrible. I wish I would have known this like a couple of years ago. And so that's a real valuable feature, which is to select the sheets, change the columns and rows at the same time. The other thing that I find that a lot of people aren't aware of is this right click over here. A lot of people aren't familiar with, if you right click on those arrows, you can actually jump to a little menu. And so some people stumble across it by accident, but most people aren't aware of that either. So those are 2 very important features that you need to know about. And the other really important feature is that you'll find at some point is when you right click on it and you want to move or copy it to a new workbook. Sometimes a lot of people would cut and paste it, and it never seems to look right in the pasted mode. So you want to take the entire worksheet and copy that worksheet to another workbook. So those are 3 very, very valuable pieces of what we've been talking about up to this point. So I want you to open up a file, go to File, Open, go to Browse, go to your C drive in the Data folder, go to Excel 365-1 folder, and in here we're looking for a file called Freeze. It's called Freeze. Now Freeze is a larger database, a larger Excel sheet, and a lot of us are dealing with larger sheets these days, so I thought this would be a good exercise to have to know how to do this from an operational perspective. So in this sheet, you've got a large information. So one of the problems we run into is these labels on top. Does everybody have the file open? One problem we have with this is that when you scroll downward like this, you lose these labels on top. See that? And so it would be nice to have those labels on top, correct? So that's why we're going to talk about this next concept called freeze. So if you click on 5 right there, click on the number 5. Make sure the whole thing is selected. Go to View. Click on this thing called Freeze Panes and choose the option called Freeze Pane. That froze the pane. So when I scroll downward, you can keep that stationary. So to unfreeze it, you would go to Freeze Panes, choose Unfreeze Pane, and now we just unfroze it. So now you can see it's undone. If I click on B, and I freeze B, then that freezes it so that when I roll to the right, that letter stays stationary. And so what it's simply doing is it's freezing everything above and to the left. So if I click right there and B5, it'll freeze everything above B5, and it will freeze everything to the left of B5.
Can you do multiple ones, like freeze the column and the rows?
Yeah, that's where you click it right there. You click on B5, and then I can say freeze it this way, and that freezes the top and the left side. See?
No, I mean like at the same time.
We did that at the same time. You have to kind of click on the cell. If you click here, you're going to do just you're going to take that piece, or you can do that piece. But if you click in a cell, right in the middle of a cell like B5, it's going to freeze everything above the cell and to the left of the cell. And that's what you're asking for, right? And so that freezes it above, so the top is frozen. Also to the right is also frozen. So that does both directions.
Okay. All right. All right.
Okay. So that freezes it both ways. Okay, so that's the idea. So now we're going to talk about a feature called split. So if you click on 17 and we want to split this screen into two different pieces, then right next to the freeze there's a button called split. And that means that I can take the bottom split and scroll to the bottom of the spreadsheet and go to the top somewhere. So if I want to copy and paste something from District 15 to District 2, I can highlight that, copy it, and paste it in that manner from screen to screen, rather than copying it and scrolling up and scrolling down. So the split allows you to kind of split the screen into two pieces. Now, if I click on the split again, it unsplits it, of course. And then I can split it in the middle this way. So say, for example, you've got a large database that goes way out like this. You can click in the middle here and split it in the middle. And that way you can move out to the right and see that information and see this on the left. Do that. You can double click on the split to break it also. So that's the idea behind this, is you can actually use the split or the freeze, depends on what you want to use. These are dealing with large database or large structures. So in this courseware, we talk about large worksheet. We talk about the freeze feature, and then we talk about the split feature. And we also get into hiding columns and rows is another way to kind of clean up your database. So if you got a really large database, you can actually clean it up by hiding columns or rows. And then there's a couple other features in here that I went through. I've created an online list is another way. So let's talk about this a little bit. So let's talk about going back to our Excel sheet. Now, if you go to example 2 is a much larger database, as you can see. It goes way out here. So you can kind of see where this kind of comes into play. So if I want to block these or lock these records on top, I would click on 2, and I would freeze my pane this way. And then I would freeze it up that way. See it? And if you want to unfreeze, you just click on your unfreeze. Or you can do your split so you can see both ends of the database at the same time. So I'm just kind of reiterating what we just talked about. But there's a couple other features. If I want to hide some features, like for example, say I want to hide all this address information. So what I have here, I've got city, state, zip, and all this. So I can select all these, right-click on them, and hide them. And that kind of cleans up my database a little bit, so I don't have so much stuff to deal with. So this is one technique people use to actually make it so they don't have to see the stuff that's not that important. So that is a hiding feature. There's one more that I think is really, really useful. It's called the outlining feature. Okay, so come over to the contact name. So we have contact first name, contact last name, contact title, and contact position. I'm going to leave the first name active. Highlight E, F, and G. And now I can hide those, but it takes a little bit more work to unhide them. So I'm going to click those 3 cells, go to the Data tab, and there's this option here called Group. So I can group those 3 fields as a group. And that actually creates this little plus sign. So I can collapse and expand that plus sign, clean up my database a bit. So now I'm going to click on J, K, L, M, N, and I don't really need to see all this address information. So I'm going to go to my Data tab, choose Group, and group that, and then we can collapse it. So what's nice about this grouping feature is you can expand it and collapse it on the demand. Where the hide feature, you have to actually select it and unhide it, and then select it and rehide it. where this is sort of dynamic, as I can expand this information if I needed to. Now that makes my database a little bit more manageable, a little bit smaller. Now I kept one field active so I knew what that field represented. This plus sign ties to this address, and this plus sign ties to this name here. So a lot of times I'll keep one field active just so I can identify what that plus sign is for. And then I wish the plus sign would have stood right on top of right up here, but didn't for some reason. But that's the way I look at it. That's the way I handle it. Okay. So that is the idea. Any questions on that? Or so I did document these. Now to remove that split, there's the ungroup feature, and then you can say clear the outline out completely. That clears it out completely. So again, you may not remember all these details, but I did put a lot of extra little feature. Here's the hide feature. I put that in white. And then I also put in the outlining feature, creating a group outline in white. And it looks like you can clear the outline too when you're done. And there's several other gray sections in here of database, large database manipulation. But the idea, those are the primary ones I want to get across. And those are the things that we use, I think we could use on a daily basis if we're using a large database.